Hussein. Give my check. Don't worry, you want the check. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. By the way, are you free on Sunday? I've got a ticket.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات. Brothers and sisters, we'd like to begin the program with the recitation of the Holy Qur'an by Zara Latif. Please can we welcome her with a loud salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والفجر وليال عشر والشفع والوتر والليل إذا يسر هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بعاد إرم ذات العماد التي لم يخلق مثلها في البلاد وثمود الذين جابوا الصخر بالواد وفرعون ذي الأوتاد الذين طغوا في البلاد فأكثروا فيها الفساد فصب عليهم ربك صوت عذاب إن ربك لبالمرصاد فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن وأما إذا ما ابتلاه فقدر عليه رزقه فيقول ربي أهانن كلا بل لا تكرمون اليتيم ولا تحاضون على طعام المسكين وتأكلون التراث أكلا لما وتحبون المال حبا جما كلا إذا دكت الأرض دكا دكا وجاء ربك والملك صفا صفا وجيء يومئذ بجهنم يومئذ يتذكر الإنسان وأنى له الذكرى يقول يا ليتني قدمت لحياتي فيومئذ لا يعذب عذابه أحد ولا يوثق وثاقه أحد يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي صلوات.
Thank you very much, Zahra, for that beautiful recitation. Our main program today will be a talk by Dr. Ali Hadawi. Please can we welcome him with a loud salawat. Dr. Ali Hadawi is an organisational leadership and management expert with extensive expertise in education institutions spanning almost 30 years. He is a founding member and the vice chairman of Rawabit Steering Group, a UK-Iraq strategic partnership that has been engaging with the Iraqi vocational and the higher education sector since early 2004. Dr. Hadawi is also a founding trustee of the Iraqi Institute for Economic Reform, which is an independent research institute based in Iraq. Please, can we have another loud salawat?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa bihi nasta'een. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. I bear witness that Muhammad, the Prophet of Allah, is his slave and his messenger. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. I send salams and salutations to Imam Hussein, his son Ali ibn al-Hussein, the martyrs, the Syeda, with him on the day of Karbala. The title of the talk is about an educationalist view, so somebody who's not an expert in religion, but an expert in education, would do with what's available out there. And that is what I intend to share with you. I think it's important that I, as they say, lay my cards in terms of what my beliefs are. So I believe that Imam Hussein is an infallible. I also believe that to follow him we are required by Allah to follow him. However, I don't believe that Imam Hussein employs miracles when he ran his life. So I look at his life as a highly elevated human being who worked really, really hard on himself to develop himself personally, and equally Syeda Zainab salamullah alayha. And that was what had enabled them to achieve that profound change to the world. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to share with you the way my brain sort of deals with all of this. So I hope you bear with me. We, of course, as human beings, we all learn in a variety of ways, and we impact the world around us also in a variety of ways. And our learning is not always necessarily in a formalized manner. So we go to school or college or university or attend a training program. These are, of course, all valid and effective, and they work. But we also learn from our interaction with each other, with other people, both positively and negatively, and we learn from these experiences. And all of these experiences shape our lives and affect the way we interact with others later. So I don't think there's anything profound in that. So that, I hope you all accept that. There's quite a bit of an introduction to this, so I hope you bear with me. I, however, believe, and I hope you agree, that things don't just happen. There isn't a great deal that happens by chance. What I mean by that is, if you are intending on achieving profound change, then you don't rely on chance or miracles. Allah Ta'ala hasn't created the world in that way. For us to achieve, for anybody to achieve profound change around them, they need to work really, really hard, not only on achieving the profound change, but before that, and maybe for a year or two, or 10 years, or a lifetime of working on themselves in terms of their spirituality, in terms of their skills, in terms of their knowledge, in terms of the way other people react to them, in terms of the way they conduct themselves, in terms of how people react to others, in terms of understanding society, in terms of understanding psychology, in terms of understanding societal norms, in terms of understanding how cultures operate. All of these things need to be worked on with some real detailed thinking and planning. Not only that, but also working on the spiritual elevation. And anybody, that is, of course, my belief, anybody who, no matter how knowledgeable they are in whichever line of science or knowledge, then they can't achieve the highest level of change in themselves and others unless they work on themselves as well. So it's not just a purely mechanical process where you've learned all the underpinnings of any branch of knowledge. So it's not, that is important and needs to be learned, and all the details of it need to be learned. But that on its own is insufficient. One needs to work on themselves to develop that inner ability to be able to affect others. And if we look throughout history, everybody who had achieved profound change in society, you'll find that they worked on themselves a great deal for decades before they were able to impact others. So that's something important that I want to set the scene for. There's something also I wanted to pick up, and that is an important hadith from our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet says, "Husaynun, thank you sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Husaynun minni wa ana min Husayn. Ahabba Allah man ahabba Husayna." So Hussein is from me, and that we understand. So he's his grandson, the son of his daughter. So we can see the linkage. We can all interpret that. And so there's a linkage here, and I am from Hussein. So how does that work? And that is a really, really tricky one. So let's pick now an ayah from the Holy Qur'an and then come back to this hadith. So Allah Ta'ala in the Holy Qur'an describes his Holy Prophet by saying, مَا يَنْطَقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. Nor does he speak of his own desire. It is only a revelation that is revealed. So things that the Prophet talks about are revealed to him. He doesn't talk out of his own desire. And I realize, of course, that in the books of tafsir, there's a great deal, ulamas have invested years of their lives debating whether that belongs to the Holy Qur'an only, or everything that the Prophet said and did. As far as I'm concerned, as an educationist, it hasn't been limited. If Allah Ta'ala had wanted it to be about the Qur'an, He would have said so. The fact that it was left open, that means to a lay person like me, it is as open as it gets. So anything that the Prophet said is a revelation. So if we go back to the hadith now, we need to ponder the thinking around what is it? What is that link between Hussein and the Prophet? How is it that the Prophet is from Hussein? And I wanted to just jump and come back to this. So if we look at this is a bit of a timeline. It doesn't tell us a great deal other than Imam Hussein was born in the year 4 Hijrah, and the Prophet passed away in the year 11 Hijrah. So we're talking about a 5-6-year-old. Potentially that hadith might have been sent when he was 3. So what is it that gets the Prophet to say something like that, not just to him, but to the companions? So he didn't just say it to Hussein, who was playing apparently in the street. And he just grabbed him, held him, kissed him, and said that. And it is across all books of hadith, this hadith. So what is it that the Prophet was trying to say? Is he just merely telling them how much he loves Hussein, or is there more to it? And if there is more to it, what are the ways in which the Prophet could be from Hussein? So let's move on. This is still the introduction. So the question is, why would he be saying that? Is it important? Is it an important part of the faith that he tells other people? Is it an important part of his message of Islam? Indeed, was Karbala an important part of Islam? Could it be that Karbala is bigger than Islam? Is it bigger than Islam? And I wanted to share with you in the ziyarah that we recite of Imam Hussein. So we talk about Imam Hussein being, he's the warith of Adam, so he is the inheritor of Adam, the Prophet. He's the inheritor of Noah. He's the inheritor of Abraham. And the question then is, what did he inherit from them? Was it knowledge? Not really. We don't know about anything like that in history. There was no knowledge transfer. Of course, there's no wealth. So what is it that he inherited? Potentially, could that be part of the answer of what is it, how is it that Muhammad is part of Hussein? Could it be that Muhammad carries the seal of all prophets? So essentially that there's a continuum of all of these messages from Allah, all being delivering not different aspects, it was just highly elevated aspects of one central message from Allah. And if that is the case, then is that what Prophet Muhammad was referring to? Because of course it's not out of nothing, so we need to spend time thinking, what is it that the Prophet had meant? And if we're establishing, if we're agreeing that that would have been a revelation, because that's what the Holy Qur'an tells us, so it's not potentially, it's not something that is out there, that is unsubstantiated. Because Allah Ta'ala tells us that, and if Allah Ta'ala had wanted it to be about the Qur'an, Allah Ta'ala would have said that, would have said the Qur'an, which indeed Allah Ta'ala does, in fact, elsewhere says the whole Qur'an is a revelation. So what is it here? Why is this ayah different? So we're still continuing now with the introduction. I'm sort of trying to build a base here. And if we look at this timeline now, and we see that the Prophet had passed away when Imam Hussein was 7. So what was the Prophet trying to establish? What was so central to his message that he wanted the Ummah to understand, acknowledge, and digest, so that this 7-year-old child would have a central position in Islam? So when the Prophet, for example, says, Al-Hasan wal-Hussein imamani qama aw qa'da, Hassan and Hussein are imams, are two imams, whether they, literal translation, stand or sat, what the meaning is, whether they actually revolt or not. Which we know, of course, Imam Hassan didn't and Imam Hussein did. And that's a totally different subject. But what was the Prophet trying to establish here? Why was the Prophet going to all these lengths to establish Hussein as potentially a central part of the message of Islam? Then just to keep in mind, when Imam Ali was martyred, Imam Hussein was 36. So we're now looking at a child who, when he was born, the Prophet said, this is a Sayyid. Potentially when he was 5 or 6 or 3, I don't know, but what we know is between the ages of 3 and 6, the Prophet said that Ana min Hussein, I am from Hussein. So there is an important continuum here between the Prophet and the Imam. Then we know that Imam Ali was martyred when Imam Hussein was 36. So the question then is, and then of course we know that the Imam was actually, he was in Imamate for 11 years before he started his journey from Medina. So what was he doing all these years? And was he just going about his life and then something happened that night and he left Medina to Mecca and then spent a few months, actually. He didn't go straight to Karbala or Kufa. He spent a few months there in Mecca. Yet he departed from Mecca midway through Hajj. And of course, you know, he wasn't catching a flight, so this journey was going to take just over 3 weeks. So he could have spent 2 more days and finished Hajj. So the point I'm trying to get to here, and that is for both, actually, Imam Hussein, because it's not just Imam Hussein here. Imam Hussein and Syeda Zainab, this whole thing, it's hand in hand. They're roughly the same age, or only 2 years apart. And potentially, Imam Hussein and Syeda Zainab, and that's the educationalist bit, would have been working on themselves and developing their inner abilities, understanding culture, understanding others, understanding their own faith, and developing their own spirituality so that potentially they could achieve the thing that has been, up to our knowledge anyway, potentially the most profound thing that a human being might have done. And if we consider that, 1400 years later, we're still sitting here having this discussion and thousands of other places all over the world, then is it that that has been achieved through this revolt that Imam Hussein and Syeda Zainab? And the reason why we need to put Imam Hussein and Syeda Zainab together, because Imam Hussein couldn't have acted on this just like that, just overnight. Al-Walid called him into, that might have been the, if you like, the 0 hour to start the activity. But he would have spent his time, his lifetime, thinking, planning, developing, making du'as, all of that, just working on his inner self, plus understanding others, and potentially thinking about every little bit of detail. Because the one thing we know, for example, is that, for example, the slogans that Imam Hussein used, or the slogans that Syeda Zainab used, what we know about them is that they transcended history. Everybody understands them. You don't have to be learned. You don't have to be a scholar. You could learn them on the go. So, for example, hayhat minna dhilla. So, we are not people who would be, I'll need help with the translation here, so somebody shout it out. We wouldn't be humiliated. So, thank you. So, essentially, what they would have worked on is a set of slogans to explain themselves to others, that whoever hears it, in whichever language it's immediately accessible. It's not language that will be accessible only by those who are learned or those who indeed are only Arabs. It wouldn't be, because it's just so simple, so accessible. If you're old, if you're young, if you're learned, if you're unlearned, everybody would understand all of these. And that, what I'm proposing here is that these wouldn't have just haphazardly happened. That's just not a coincidence, it's just inconceivable. All of that would have required a great deal of thinking, perseverance, self-development, self-growth, so that they could get to a stage where they could impact humanity in the way they have. So, for example, the 10 years between when Imam Hussein became an imam and his movement, say from Medina to Mecca, what would he have been doing? I mean, it's inconceivable that he was just going about his daily life as normal. And then Al-Walid, incidentally, if you don't recognize the name, was the governor of Medina, who was instructed by Yazid to insist that Imam Hussein would swear allegiance to Yazid, which was the trigger. So then the next morning, Imam Hussein leaves. What I'm proposing here is that Imam Hussein would have worked that out years before, because the oppression with which Muawiyah had run the whole of the Muslim land wouldn't have left that to potentially somebody like me. I could have worked that out. So a leader of that caliber, an imam, wouldn't have just not known, not expected, not anticipated this, and just went about his daily life. And then one evening, Al-Walid calls him, and the next morning, he just decides to set off to Mecca. It's just inconceivable. It's not possible. We either believe he is a leader of his time, in which case he would have been very capable of understanding and analyzing the world around him. Also, when we read in history, Muawiyah was a very clever man, a strategist. In fact, I would argue we still live through some of what he's done. But Muawiyah did something that was really, really important. Remember that the Muslim empire in his day was very wealthy. And wealthy states are able to do things, as we see now. It's no different. So Muawiyah developed the most advanced way of communication at that time. So he was able to get his messages out to all the Muslim regions and get messages back from all the Muslim regions. Of course, that wasn't available to Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein had to rely on, for example, Hajj. When people would be open to Imam Hussein, of course. He's the grandson of the Prophet. And they were only very close to the time of the Prophet. So they would have either met the Prophet, known him, befriended him, or knew people who had known the Prophet. So Imam Hussein would have had to rely on people coming to Hajj, for example, so he could see them in Mecca, and then send messages out again after Hajj. But other than that, nothing like the systems that were available to Muawiyah. So, is it conceivable that Imam Hussein and Zainab were just thrusted into this in their mid-50s and then were able to perform in the way they did? Because I don't think anybody would disagree that they performed in such a magnificent way that they impacted history until now. What I'm suggesting here is that the answer is no, that's just not possible. They would have been working on themselves spiritually, working on their own skill set, working on their knowledge, working on the way they interact with others, working on the way they understand culture, so that they are able to perform this massive project that is potentially not just Islamic, but across all religions. In which case, if that was the case, so what were the ways in which they worked on themselves to develop that, that self-development? Because as I'd like to suggest here that it's not just about a set of skills. So, we train somebody, and this is the thing I, spend my life, as in paid life, doing. It's just, and potentially you can train anybody on anything. There are some people who are predisposed to one way of learning than others, but there's nothing that nobody could learn. Everybody could learn anything, provided they've got the will, they want to do it, and they've got time, and they've got a good trainer. And that's all it takes. But to do the self-development and the self-awareness so that on the day of Ashura, they could perform in the way they did. Not only that, notice that, I need to check the time, I've got 5 more minutes. Notice that even on the day of Ashura, there was a great deal of, Imam Hussein, until the very last moments, he hadn't given up. He was still preaching, he was still inviting people. And in fact, though we read in history that Hur, for example, changed his allegiances and fought on the side of Imam Hussein and was martyred, I don't know if it interests you, but when I actually started to look into it, he wasn't the only one. Hur was significant because he was a leader of a big tribe. He was significant in himself. But there were lots of people who changed allegiance, maybe not with the significance of Hur. In fact, there were some who didn't even manage to fight, because the moment they said, oh, I'm changing sides, they got, the people around them rounded them and killed them. But you see, on this front, if one was to propose that Imam Hussein came because the people of Kufa had sent him the letters and he came, and if he had known that they weren't going to be truthful, then he wouldn't have come. I just find that just so naive and simplistic. Of course, Imam Hussein, if the people of Kufa, who were mainly, we're talking about the army of Sham, if people had changed and said, now that we can see you and now that you have preached to us, we will change. Of course, Imam Hussein would rule, yes. But that wasn't what he had come in for. He knew from the outset, in fact, we've just established, even when he was 3 or 4 years old, the Prophet was preparing the ground for this Hussein to carry out something that is profound, not only for Islam, but for the whole of humanity. So the creation of Allah Ta'ala. And that is why what I'm suggesting from the way I read, as just somebody who spent their life training and developing people, is that Imam Hussein would have had to go through, and Syeda Zainab, of course, would have had to go through all of these personal development so that they can start to affect people. And they would have thought in great depth and great detail about everything they've said, everything they've done. So the fact that Imam Hussein, for example, did a massive dua that took 1 hour and 15 minutes on Arafah, yet decided not to complete Hajj. That wasn't a coincidence. That was planned to create maximum impact. So we've talked about this, planning, I need to move faster. So, for example, was it left to chance that people have decided to use storytelling as a way of conveying the story across centuries, across cultures, across continents? Well, the argument doesn't stack up. It's actually much more likely that that was planned in detail. And that was Syeda Zainab's role. And that is why I wouldn't be exercised one bit that there was no academic writing of it for 10, 15, I think it's 50 years actually. I don't think that's an issue because that wasn't the norm. The norm was storytelling, and it proved that it worked because we still have it. So if we look, I'm going to just jump over a couple of course, storytelling now is it's the latest big thing in leadership and management. Yet, it wasn't employed by coincidence. It was deliberately planned that way by the Imam and Syeda Zainab. So I'd like to just pick one. I don't think you can read it. It's too much here. It's quite dense. But see, if you look at Syeda Zainab, the way that she addressed the Yazid, so she says, فَكِدْ كَيْدَكْ وَسَعْسَعْيَكْ وَنَاصِبْ جُهْدَكْ فَوَاللَّهِ لَا تَمْحُ ذِكْرَنَا. So it's really precise, really powerful. So this woman who might have spent all her life, the way we understand, spent her life at home, not interacting in a big way in society, how is it that she just gets thrusted into this and starts to be able, in the court of the most oppressive ruler of the time, she would walk in with that power. Now, of course, this is what I'm saying. It's not a miracle. She would have worked on herself. She was in her mid-50s, and she would have worked on herself, and she would have developed. Imam Ali would have worked on her. She would have interacted with women in society, Muslim women and others, so that she's got that skill set. She's able to articulate. She doesn't get easily rattled, if you like. We've talked about researchers not being exercised. And sorry if I've taken a little bit too much, but there is a minute or two, hopefully, for questions. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hadawi, for that very insightful talk. We've got a few minutes for questions, so if there are any on either side, we'll start on the sisters. Just one on the brother's side.
Thank you very much, Ali. Just something about chance. There is a very nice saying by Louis Pasteur, and he says, chance favors the prepared person.
Absolutely.
I think that's the way to contextualize.
Indeed. Thank you, yes. In fact, I'll make a note of it and use it next time.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. Particularly liked, the angle you kind of came at it from an educator, and also being an educator, I'd just like to know, how has the story of Imam Hussein, I guess, impacted the way you educate? And yeah, I guess, what you've kind of learned from the fact that they were prepared or whatever, did it kind of impact how you did your job, I guess?
Thank you. It's a difficult question. It's a really, really good question. It's a difficult one. I think I can't claim that, it wouldn't be probably unfair. There are two aspects to Imam Hussein and Syeda Zainab's movement that have always impacted my life. One about preparation. So you can't prepare enough, because I actually believe that Imam Hussein didn't leave anything to chance. Every single slogan, every bit of timing to the finest detail was all planned meticulously, preparing his people. Who did he take with him? Who did he not take with him? Why? Every little bit was planned. And I've attempted to do that in my life. And the other is to be sort of genuinely, truthfully just to others. Because Imam Hussein, actually, even on the day of Ashura, even after they killed half his family and all of his followers, he was still preaching to them. And there is a central message here, is that none of this is about me, the person. All of this is about the one God that we will all be judged by one day. Thank you.
Couple of questions on the brother's side.
Salam. I just wanted to ask, how can we apply those actions you mentioned in those 10 years to modern day?
Ooh, good question. So it's to pick up on Sister Maryam's question. So it's really to think in detail and then work really, really meticulously on developing yourself. You know, we all need to develop ourselves both spiritually, in terms of the skills that we have, in terms of how people do things, learning about them, preparing ourselves, so we don't leave anything to chance in our lives. We really work really, really hard to develop so we can achieve change. I think there was a question here as well. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Dr. MashaAllah. It's really good talk. The point I want to mention is I think there's an other element into it, which is the element of a Ja'l al-Ilahi. There's a chosen Imam from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is an element as well, because when like any person would, how much self-development they want to get and self-purification, they won't reach to that, because at the end of the day also there's an element of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is chosen from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take that role as well. Obviously there's an element of purification and self-development, looking back, for example, at Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam and how much development he went through. So that's an idea as well. But I think especially for Imam Hussein and for his revolution, I think there is that element that without he's been chosen from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anyone else wouldn't have taken that role.
I'm not qualified to talk about Ja'l al-Ilahi, and Allah Ta'ala made Imam Hussein able to do these things, so that's Ja'l al-Ilahi. But I would argue as an educator, so for example, Imam Hussein on the day of Arafah stood there and made an hour and 15 minutes dua. What was the purpose of that? Was it just to teach, just before and then literally just that moment, then he departed, he left Hajj, so he didn't complete that Hajj. So was it just to teach others how to make dua, or was it he needed to make that dua to enable him to do this most profound journey throughout history for the whole of humanity? Me as Ali, not as a scholar, I would subscribe to this latter. But I'm not qualified to talk about the former, so I wouldn't be able to.
Just one final question, Jamil Uncle.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Many thanks for the talk. The only thing we know about Imam Hussein really is the Karbala. We don't know much about him really. You're mentioning that obviously he was preparing for 10 years. I say probably the whole of his life, not just the 10 years, because he was developing himself all along, not just the 10 years. Same with Janab Zainab as well. But all we know is really that thing that happened in Karbala. And so, I mean, we don't really know what happened. You said that Muawiyah had a lot of things, facilities, he could do things. But our knowledge is so little on that sense. And I'm sure he was developing himself, but he would have developed himself all along his life. That sort of thing that I would have thought would be the case.
So I'm glad you've raised this point, because in case I've misled you, the point I was trying to make is, in fact, Imam Hussein from his birth was preparing. The last 10 years I'm questioning the thinking that we don't know what he was doing. So what would he have been doing for 10 years when he was an Imam? But my point is, from birth, Hussein was being prepared, and he is preparing himself and being prepared by his parents. Clearly the Prophet did, because why would the Prophet say such a profound hadith that is every book of hadith quotes? Of course, there's a reason. You know, he was preparing the ground for this person, this child, potentially when he grows up, to achieve that, great things, if you like. So yes, the whole of his life, not just the last 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ahsantum,
I think we'll
thank
end there
you.
with the loud salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Just a reminder that on Sunday we will have our Wafat program of Imam Hussein and Imam Zainab Abidin. Inshallah, the program will begin at 7 p.m. with dinner, followed by Quran recitation, live poetry, and main talk by Sheikh